For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Today our guest is Kevin Rudd, former Australia Prime Minister. He's the Global President of Asia Society and is the author of this book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. Mr. Rudd, pleasure hosting you in India. Thanks for coming down, and it's great to do one in person, not just one online.
It's good to be back in Delhi. It's been too long, so it's great to be back.
COVID. Straight away, recent developments, Taiwan, Speaker Pelosi, the developments that took place after that, China's reaction, the rest of the world's reaction. Do you see war between the two sides as unavoidable? You do say it's an avoidable war.
It's certainly avoidable, but it's now becoming more possible. I've been looking at the US-China relationship for 30 or 40 years, since I was a junior woodchuck in the Australian Embassy in Beijing back in the 1980s. And so, having looked at the evolution of US-China as foreign minister, as prime minister, as a professional diplomat, and now head of an American think tank, it's really the first time I've become quite worried about the real risk of armed conflict and war. And therefore, I thought it was time to put pen to paper to analyze the nature of the problem, but also to put forward some practical recommendations about how to avoid what I think would be a catastrophic conflict for everybody, not just for the Chinese and the Americans.
50 years since Kissinger and Nixon's sojourn, and lots has happened since then. You met Mr. Kissinger himself, who's hale and hearty. Is he worried as well about the...
I believe so, from what Henry has written, and certainly from my own discussions with him. In fact, I was talking to him literally the other day. He's at the tender age of 99. He says he no longer believes in long-term planning, only medium-term planning. But Henry is as worried as I am about this. There's a couple of reasons why I'm objectively concerned. One is the balance of power has shifted. China is more powerful than it was, militarily, economically, technologically. And secondly, Xi Jinping is a different leader to his predecessors. He's more assertive in foreign policy and security policy terms. So therefore, we're in a whole new set of dynamics. And there are too many issues unfolding at once, too fragile a political and diplomatic relationship to provide the normal insulation against crises, and too much what I describe as metal on metal. South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, aircraft, naval vessels. Put all that together, it's enough to make any grown man feel nervous.
Xi Jinping, and you've written a lot about it in your book, man in a hurry, but he has a timeline, 2049. But do you think things are accelerating before that timeline?
Well, the very interesting thing, an important thing for us all to notice about Xi Jinping on Taiwan is that he's the first Chinese political leader to make it clear that for China's great national rejuvenation to occur, their term, 中华民族伟大复兴, it can only occur with Taiwan. No previous Chinese leader has said that. And 2049, therefore, is the deadline. We might say, well, that's a long way away. Well, it's 27 years away. And I'm old enough to remember when we were in Hong Kong in 1997. And that's now 25 years ago. So it's therefore something for us to focus on. And secondly, his timetable for military reform of the PLA comes to a conclusion in 2027. So I'm quite concerned about the late 20s, early 30s. Xi Jinping plans still to be in office well into his 80s. And under those circumstances, he sees himself as a man of history, wanting to bring this to conclusion within his own political lifetime.
Not just Taiwan. I mean, we're looking at territorial aggression. India has witnessed it firsthand, lost blood along the LAC, Ladakh. Why has that happened, or is that part of Xi Jinping's whole plan?
Xi Jinping, as I say in the book, is a man in a hurry, so he's not about preserving the status quo. So where China militarily can change the situation on the ground, either through direct military action or through what's referred to in the literature as grey zone activity, on land or at sea, can change the situation on the ground, then he will do so. You can see this unfolding in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, no longer observing the so-called median line. In the East China Sea, this barrage of challenges against the Japanese self-defense force on a daily basis, almost to test them out. And then, of course, in India, with a series of, shall we say, incidents and events, really since around 2014, 2015, through until the president, and most spectacularly, most recently at Ladakh. So for me, this forms a pattern of behaviour, which is to assert, to act, to change the situation on the ground, to consolidate, and then to rest, and then to assert again.
So in that sense, India should not have been surprised with what happened on the LAC, because we were engaging. Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping had summits, whether in China or in India. We should not have been surprised.
Well, in many respects, I've never seen Chinese diplomatic activity necessarily constraining Chinese military activity. Let me give you an example. So in the period of 2014-15, at a time when China was actively promoting the desirability of a new type of great power relationship with the United States and the Obama administration, and working intimately with the Obama administration in the lead up to the Paris conference on climate change in 2015. At the same time, militarily, China was unfolding island reclamation activity in 7 locations across the South China Sea. So to assume that diplomacy necessarily constrains military policy, I don't think is the right way to read it. At the same time, we need to view summit opportunities with Xi Jinping as an opportunity to deal with China's paramount leader, but to recognize that this is an avenue for direct communication with a paramount leader, which needs to also reflect the reality of our actions and our power on the ground, not disconnected from those two things.
So, talking about surprise, were the Chinese surprised by the pushback? Not just India, were you saying Taiwan, Japan, Philippines?
Well, the Chinese Marxist-Leninist political system is anchored on, I think, 2 or 3 principles which we should bear in mind. One is it's deeply realist about the exercise of power. Therefore, they are very focused on what we do, not what we say. Number 2, the Chinese Marxist-Leninist system is always focused on strength rather than weakness. It is respectful of strength and it's contemptuous of weakness. But thirdly, they're also almost built-in dialecticians. That is, they're waiting for the response or the reaction. And so I think when you look across the board, you've seen 4 or 5 things unfold. Since 2017, a hardening of US national security strategy against China, the new national security strategy of November 17, the definition of China as a strategic competitor. You've also seen the hardening of Japanese security policy, not just under Abe-san, but also under Suga-san and now under Kishida-san as well. And of course, you have seen the parallel hardening of responses here in India as one border incident adds to another, culminating in India's decision in 2020, 2021 to move towards the elevation of the Quad to summit level and the evolution of the Quad since then. And I think China also, seeing dialectically but I think, surprised by the level of European solidarity around Ukraine after the Russian invasion, and European anxiety being directed at China's diplomatic and economic support for Russia's position. So it has been a general reaction around the world to China's rise and China's assertiveness that we see these manifestations of response. So at one level, China has expected these responses, theoretically, but has been at a practical level surprised by them as well.
So what's the logic of taking on so many different fronts
That is
at the same time?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because there are many aphorisms in Chinese strategic classical literature which caution against taking on adversaries north, south, east, and west. It runs against the grain of traditional strategic logic. So therefore, I ask this question as well, and you are right to ask it. And I wish I had an easy answer for you. And what I've seen is a different pattern of Chinese responses. There was a time back in 2018, 2019, when you saw it with China's high-level summitry with India, both in Wuhan and at Chennai. Also overtures to Abe-san about the possibility of a summit with Abe, which then unfolded in Beijing, and a reciprocal summit in Tokyo, which did not happen. And with the United States, no parallel action because of the US-China trade war at the time. But with other countries, including Australia, some softening in the posture immediately pre-COVID. But then once COVID hit, it was like a new strategic reality overtook Beijing again. And therefore the olive branches to Tokyo, to Delhi, to Canberra disappeared. And we're now into a new strategic reality, which is all fronts at once. I think that has been underpinned by China's own sense of domestic political siege because of the COVID realities at home, then the US-China trade war, and then compounding that since 2022 at least, the new reality of a binary strategic response almost across the world to China, Russia, Ukraine.
It's right, you're talking about a new reality. Now, Narendra Modi is not Pandit Nehru, and 2022 is not 1962. How do the Chinese view India? And Prime Minister Modi in particular, his policies?
My judgment is, though I don't pretend to be an expert in India-China relations, I'm a student of India-China relations rather than an expert in it, is that our Chinese friends, having seen India emerge through its own democratic processes with a strong BJP government, with its electoral mandate reinforced, and with the Congress party in some political disarray within India, and with Modi therefore on track for further electoral victory when the next elections are held. But the Chinese will see, despite their contempt for democracies generally, that is, they can't govern themselves, they'll see Modi emerging as a strong personality, a strong leader against the historical benchmarks of the Indian democracy. Secondly, what they'll see is an Indian economy which continues to grow. And the fact that India, in the difficult global economic circumstances of 2021, 2022, registering growth of 6% plus, when China is finding it difficult to achieve 3% in the current circumstances, they'll be admiring of that. And furthermore, India's emergence as a technology power as well. So I think for those sort of reasons, China sees Prime Minister Modi's government as developing a strong India, led by a realist government with a robust China strategy of its own, reinforced by the reality of the Quad.
The end goal that Xi Jinping is aiming at in terms of China being the predominant power, 2047, 49, will he do anything to achieve that, which means going to war as well?
In terms of Taiwan, Xi Jinping's calculus is that Taiwan must be part of China's great renewal by 2049. And therefore, if that means taking military action by then, my judgment at this stage is that he will do so. I don't believe he's ready to do so in this decade, because China in his calculus is not militarily or financially or economically in a robust enough position to be guaranteed of success. There are too many risks associated with doing it this decade. The concern in the 2020s is more one of crisis escalation, conflict and war by accident, that is by incident, as opposed to conscious design. I think the United States and Taiwan's opportunity during the 2020s is to sufficiently rebuild their own deterrence at a military and economic and technological level that it would cause PLA commanders to tell Xi Jinping in the 2030s, Comrade Chairman, it's still too risky. That, I think, lies at the kernel of US and Taiwanese strategy right now. So would Xi Jinping therefore still pull the switch? Xi Jinping, in my judgment, is a calculated risk taker, unlike his predecessors. But if the PLA commanders said to him at the same time, too risky, I think he would be inclined to listen. Paragraph 1 of Sun Tzu's Art of War says this: war is a great matter of state. If you lose the war, you lose the state. So under those circumstances, no Chinese political leader will be interested in losing the state, given that they have spent blood, sweat and tears in conquering the state in the first place, building the state over the preceding 75 years plus, and then to lose the state in a military folly over Taiwan. I think there'll be a high degree of caution, but I still see it is highly possible, 4 out of 10, in my judgment, to tripwire into this conflict through an accident.
But the structure of the Chinese state, or one-man state, do you think the PLA generals would give him actual advice when you're saying that's too risky? We saw what happened to Putin.
Well, that's an excellent question, and I don't know the nature of the PLA internal structures well enough to be confident in my judgment. What I do know about the PLA is that they're deeply conscious of their lack of field experience. Ask yourself this question: if you're about to embark upon the single largest amphibious operation since D-Day, when was the last time China engaged in a major naval battle of its own? The answer is 1895, between the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan. And the Qing came off rather badly. They lost Korea and Taiwan as a result. So there is a degree of strategic caution within the Chinese professional system. At the same time, the Chinese have embarked upon a phenomenal expansion of their naval capabilities, a rapid upgrade in terms of their military training. So therefore, there'll be pressure on them to perform. Remember, Xi Jinping's doctrine, as I outline in this book, is to have a PLA capable of fighting and winning wars, not just a PLA capable of putting on a good parade on the 1st of October every year. So it will be a near-run thing in terms of whether the PLA would have the chutzpah to say to the Comrade Chairman Bushing, which is Chinese for it won't work, or it's too risky. They'll know that the political pressure will be in the reverse direction, which is to do it. So it requires some courage as a PLA commander to say that it is still too risky. But if you are the United States, if you're Taiwan, if you're an ally of the United States, or a friend of the United States like India, then the key question is, will the United States be able to enhance deterrence in the meantime to increase the probability of the PLA advising Xi Jinping to exercise caution?
And internally, how do you see it in terms of, how do I put my finger on it? The Chinese demography, will Chinese, if Xi Jinping has to take military action for whatever reason that he thinks is necessary, the Chinese people, the Chinese families, are they willing to sacrifice their children in war?
Again, an excellent question to ask. And we should reflect further on the nature of the particular scenarios which could be deployed against Taiwan. We should not necessarily assume that this is going to be a massive amphibious operation. It could begin with a massive naval blockade, which has been trialled most recently in the period after the Pelosi visit. It could be trialled or executed in part through a massive cyber attack on Taiwan's critical economic infrastructure. It could be engineered in part by salami slicing Taiwan, going for the offshore islands first. So we shouldn't therefore assume that it will be mass casualties up front. In fact, they would be predisposed not to doing that for the reasons you point out, but also because they don't want iPhone footage of the killing of tens of thousands of Taiwanese, therefore Chinese civilians. That's bad karma in the view of a Chinese domestic political audience itself. So I think, therefore, there are other deterrent factors at work, but against the strength of the Chinese political will to do this, we would be foolish to underestimate it. That Xi Jinping sees himself as this man of history. But Taiwanese deterrence, American deterrence, Allied deterrence, the risk of, shall we say, comprehensive financial and economic sanctions from around the world, which would crush the Chinese economy, but also crush the global economy. These are all big deterrent factors.
Deterrence, as you were talking about, how do the Chinese view, say, for example, the Quad, its capabilities, its capacities? Is it, despite the words that are used currently, it has made a lot of progress, but is it primed to move in a security direction if China continues to assert itself aggressively?
I think those who have designed the Quad in Washington, in Tokyo, in Delhi and in Canberra have been quite clever about this because they've designed it as an elastic instrument. It can be extended in different directions. Right now it's a political summit mechanism. It's a vehicle for foreign policy coordination. It's also about to become increasingly a vehicle for coordination of policy on the economy, on technology, even on climate. I was talking to the Australian climate minister the other day who told me he's about to have the Quad climate ministers in town. Well,
wow.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But it's not yet, as you know, a military arrangement, but we do have Malabar, which is now involving all four Quad partners. So I suspect that the strategic logic of the Quad is one which could be expanded over time, vertically or horizontally, depending on how China's own strategic behavior unfolds. So from China's own strategic calculus point of view, the emergence of the Quad is a new factor in the overall geostrategic equation. I think Beijing has been surprised that the four of us could actually agree to work with each other. I think they'd assumed that we are so different, Japanese, Australians, Indians, and the Americans. Only two of us play cricket. That these guys could actually have got together. So I think they've moved from surprise and derision to concern and at least diplomatic attack, which is currently where the nature of the business lies.
You said you are a student of India and China's relations, not an expert, but I would beg to differ. But how do you see India's China policy? We've not talked about Taiwan much. We're not developing our relations, even economic, with Taiwan to hassle the Chinese. And that's a big thing that the Taiwanese bring up with India. I mean, you're not really moving. Tibet as well. The Dalai Lama was taken on a military chopper to Ladakh. But are those issues that India should be keeping in abeyance for when a crisis hits, or?
Well, I think Delhi will calibrate its actions within the framework of the Quad over time. And the thing about the Quad is that not all of our strategic policy settings are identical.
Yeah.
They overlap significantly now, but there is still room for divergence. For example, I think the Quad partners are relatively relaxed about India's posture in relation to Russia and Ukraine. Everyone understands the complexity of the history of the military relationship and the supply of military equipment. At the same time, I don't think there's an expectation in Delhi that Tokyo, Canberra and Washington will automatically mirror every element of Indian policy towards Pakistan over Kashmir. So you see these are intersecting sets, they're not identical sets. But in the future, as far as Indian policy is concerned, I think Foreign Minister Jaishankar sort of hit the nail on the head when he said there can be no normalisation in the China relationship until we normalise the border. That's a clear-cut statement. China currently is showing no predisposition to do that. For me, it remains an open question whether in the future they might. There's no evidence to that effect at the moment. But as I indicate in the book, we should all at least hypothetically consider the possibility of a grand diplomatic gesture by Xi Jinping at some point in the future to take a leaf out of Deng Xiaoping's book, as Deng did with the Sino-Soviet border in 1989, normalise the border with India, and then seek to construct a new global, as it were, geopolitical, geoeconomic entity around China, India and Russia. That may be the sort of strategic thinking which might be alive in the back of the cerebral cortex of Xi Jinping's worldview. And what would India do under those circumstances? Could India accept a global order which had China as its geopolitical centre? Because that would be the logic. And how would India feel under those circumstances in terms of the Chinese economy? And would it create more opportunities or more threats for India under those circumstances? I don't know the answer to either of those questions, but we should begin thinking about them, at least hypothetically, even though I see no prospect of it in the near to medium term.
Post the party congress, maybe.
Well, or the Congress after that, I'm not sure. But in geopolitics, nothing is forever. The question is,
Nothing.
how long is the long term?
Nothing is forever. We saw what Russia and China were arch enemies, and now they have a limitless partnership.
Well, that's true. And I'm a student of the Sino-Soviet relationship. What's extraordinary, if you look at that period 49 to 59, the Sino-Soviet relationship, it was the single largest economic transfer between one state and another in economic history. It was a massive transfer of industrial capacity from the Soviet Union to its new partner in global socialism, the People's Republic of China. Then bang, blows up over politics. Khrushchev, the repudiation of Stalin, which Mao took as an indirect attack on himself. Bang, that was the end of that. And then a decade later, less than a decade later, you have Sino-Soviet border wars, and then a protracted period between then and 89, where the road outside the Russian embassy in Beijing was called Anti-Revisionism Street.
Oh, really? Wow.
反修正主义, yeah. It was, I mean, they take it seriously, the Chinese, when they turn. Through to the normalization of the border under Deng, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then there's incremental build back of the relationship, which really takes off after 2014, when the Russians conclude under Putin they've got nowhere else to go after their initial invasion of Crimea. So who knows where that particular relationship could go. And therefore, nothing is etched in stone in terms of India either. What we see for the immediate strategic horizon is China incrementally building a posture on the Sino-Indian border, which creates new realities on the ground. But in the back of my mind, and knowing that Xi Jinping sees himself as a grand strategist, I would not rule out the possibility that he may one day see this as an opportunity for a grand strategic play. Go back to the Zhou Enlai-Nehru formula of the 50s for resolving the border before it all exploded in 62. Find a face-saving formula for everybody. And then what? Interesting question.
Extremely. The consequences for Russia-China relationship, and if it continues to deepen, widen, broaden for countries like India?
I think, therefore, for the near to medium term, by which I couch as being the next 5 to 10 years, we should prepare ourselves for China and Russia to increasingly becoming a strategic condominium, an integrated security policy, an integrated foreign policy, an integrated economic policy. And that's because Russia is now the junior partner. And Russia has no other options other than China. And that's where Xi Jinping wants Russia to be. It'll be an interesting question, given that nothing is frozen forever, as to when that engenders its own domestic political reaction within Russia. But Putin plans to be in office until 2036. Xi Jinping, in my judgment, until 2037 at least. And so therefore, for 15 years, we have this emerging reality where I think it will be increasingly like this. And therefore, for the short to medium term, I believe that will create more and more challenges for India, and frankly, for the rest of the Quad partners as well.
More and more like this, China and Pakistan, how do you see that developing for India?
Well, I think China and Pakistan has kind of been like this for a very long time.
True.
At least since the 70s. And therefore, and probably since the 60s. And I don't see that changing. China has a deep view of its very small number of strategic alliances. And that is, even with North Korea, where it has spent blood and treasure in the Korean War of 1950 to 53, that despite how crazy subsequent North Korean leaders have been from time to time, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, etc., that the Chinese have been deeply reluctant to abandon that fundamental strategic relationship despite North Korea's demonstrable nuclear proliferation program and all the problems it would create for China if North Korea went nuclear. Similarly with Pakistan, the all-weather ally. China doesn't have many of those. And so therefore, China is unlikely to abandon Pakistan, whatever frictions and tensions arise. So I see that as basically remaining rock solid, and I see China-Russia becoming more rock solid for the next 5 to 10 years, which is my definition of the short to medium term.
There has been a recalibration in terms of the BRI or CPEC, BRI, the larger question. But do you see China, there has been movement in Afghanistan as well with the Chinese. MOU signed on petroleum, mining they already had in Messana. Do you see that extension that China will try and go through Afghanistan? And how do you see them tackling the security situation? I mean, of course, the Taliban are in part.
Well, the BRI, I think, is a work in progress. And when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative globally, what I find fascinating is that China, in my judgment, is coming under considerable domestic financial and economic pressure to sustain this gargantuan initiative, originally projected as being $3 trillion in size, to doing that in practice. The calculations I've seen is that there may be commitments so far of up to $1 trillion, but even for a $16 trillion economy, $1 trillion is not a piece of loose change. It's quite a lot of money. 3 trillion even more so, when you start talking about the equivalent of 20% of Chinese GDP. And so our good friends at the Chinese Ministry of Finance and the Chinese People's Bank of China, the China Investment Corporation, the China Development Bank, I'm sure are all quietly saying to the Chinese leadership, comrades, we're not made of money. This actually is very expensive. And guess what? Some of these deals aren't turning out so well. The rate of return is not what we thought. The repayment schedule is not happening. And however many Sri Lankan ports we may turn into 99-year leases, it still doesn't return a cash flow back to the investor. So there's that set of constraints. Specifically on your question on Afghanistan, my judgment there is China sees Afghanistan as a neighbouring state, one of its 14 land neighbours, and therefore it falls within the strategic remit of what they'd call neighbouring state diplomacy, 周边国家外交. They have a category for it. Mm-hmm. And within that, the premium will be on causing Afghanistan to become economically dependent on China through foreign direct investment flows, through trade flows and the rest. And whatever the politics domestically of the Taliban, China will live with those politics, but cause the Taliban writ large to be increasingly foreign policy compliant towards China's interests. If Afghanistan's domestic security completely implodes, always possible given the history of Afghanistan, then that becomes a different question. China will be extremely reluctant to become directly involved in the provision of security within Afghanistan, beyond the immediate projects it's investing in. But it would be a threshold question for China. Did they have to assume a new and more substantial security role to stabilize a neighboring state? Historically, they don't like doing that, but nothing is forever. Again, in the question of China seeking to secure compliant states on its periphery.
Nothing is forever. Cash flows you're talking about. How do you see the Chinese economy and how it has been faring much lower levels of growth in terms of the timeline and the projection that Xi Jinping wants to achieve? Will it impact that?
My judgment is that the economy remains Xi Jinping's Achilles heel. I've been writing this for some years now, even before it was fashionable to write it. And you need to understand the drivers of China's economic difficulties. One is demography, which we're familiar with. Peaking population, aging population, second lowest birth rate in the world, 1.16. And on top of that, you have already a shrinking workforce for the last 8 years. Therefore, wage levels going up, wage competitiveness against other countries becoming much more problematic. That's one set of irreversible structural factors. Ideologically, you have a set of reversible factors if China chose to do it. But since 2017, Xi Jinping has advanced a more Marxist agenda for the Chinese economy. And as a result of that, you see declining levels of private sector business confidence, declining levels of private fixed capital investment, and declining levels of overall productivity growth, and therefore economic growth. And then you've rolled in the COVID factors of the last 6 to 12 months. Put all those things together, if Xi Jinping faces a challenge at the 20th Party Congress, which is how to reverse economic course, or whether he actually wants to. If he doesn't, then you could well see China's economic growth rate slowing to something like 3 to 4%, and maybe in the 2030s slowing to 2 to 3%. And under those circumstances, what then? India's challenge and opportunity is to actually become, with a renewable energy transformation of the economy, under Prime Minister Modi's net zero ambition, to re-engineer global manufacturing anchored here in India. And therefore, if India does several things at the same time, renewable energy transformation, the new global factory becoming the world's new China, that becomes very interesting in global geopolitics. Of course, the decision-making powers lie with Delhi on that. But if China slows and India accelerates, geopolitics could be quite different.
So you agree with one of your former prime ministers as well, I think it was Mr. Abbott, who said in Delhi, if I'm not mistaken, during the Raisina dialogue, that in 50 years, India will be the leader of the free world.
I'm not a 50-year planner. I'm more modest than my conservative colleague, Mr. Abbott. But India has much going for it. You're a raucous democracy. Certainly there are challenges within the democracy. I'm familiar with all of that. I'm a politician. Secondly, the economy, however, is growing strongly. Thirdly, you're embracing rather than rejecting the renewable energy transformation. And on top of that, you have this emerging geopolitical relationship with the Quad, and potentially beyond the Quad with Europe. I would see the Europe as lying as the fifth unspoken part of the unfolding Quad. And under those circumstances, India emerges as a critical part of the future global balance of power, but also global soft power as well. An interesting set of potentialities for India in the medium to long term.
Mr. Rudd, time has flown. I can see Tom getting a bit fidgety. Thank you for letting us pick your brain for so long. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you here in Delhi again. Thank you.
Great to be here and great to be on the program.
Pleasure, sir. Thanks. And do send in your feedback about this interview and all our other interviews. You know all our social media handles, and you can help support us. There's a link in the YouTube descriptor. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.